Hello everyone, hello teacher. Today we're going to discuss the physiological basis of behavior, investigation of the formation and inhibition of conditioned reflexes. Introduction. The word reflex is widely used in the neuroscience and in psychology, as well as in everyday life, for different purposes and with different meanings. A definition that encompasses these different uses is a reflex is a behavior that reliably occurs at a characteristic latency after a particular stimulus. Reflexes are typically simple behaviors elicited by simple stimulus. Some well-known examples are the knee-jerk reflex, in which sudden muscle stretch causes the muscle to contract, the salivary reflex, in which the taste of food triggers salivation, and the startle reflex, in which a loud sound elicits widespread muscle contraction. These examples and other reflexes typically present in normal animals and humans are called unconditioned reflexes. Before we start, we should discuss these important terms. Stimulus, something that exists in the surroundings or that is presented. Response, how the animal responds to the stimuli. The unconditioned stimulus is one that naturally and automatically triggers a response. The unconditioned response is the unlearned response that occurs naturally. The neutral stimulus is a stimulus which initially produces no specific response other than focusing attention. The conditioned stimulus, usually neutral, and produces no particular response at first, but after conditioning, it elicits the conditioned response. The conditioned response is the learned response to the previously neutral stimulus.
Conditioned reflexes. The conditioned reflex is a systemic adaptive reaction individually acquired during life or special study and is based on the temporary connection between the conditioned irritant and the unconditioned action. The term conditioned reflex was first used by the Russian physiologist Ivan Petrovich Pavlov to denote the criterion measure of a behavioral element of learning, that is, a new association between the signal and the consequential event referred to as the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus, respectively. In Pavlov's classic experiment, the conditioned stimulus was a bell and the unconditioned stimulus was sour fluid, which is food, delivered into the mouth of a dog, restrained by harness. The conditioned stimulus was followed by the unconditioned stimulus, regardless of the dog's response. After training, the conditioned reflex was manifested when the dog salivated to the sound of the bell. Some differences between the conditioned and unconditioned reflexes. The unconditioned reflexes are inborn, inherited reactions, while the conditioned reflexes are reactions acquired by organism in the course of its individual development on the basis of life experience. The unconditioned reflexes are specific, characteristic of all representatives of a given species, while the conditioned are individual and can be present in some members of a species and absent in others. The unconditioned reflexes are relatively stable, while the conditioned are unstable and may be developed, reinforced, and extinguished under definite conditions. The unconditioned reflexes are evoked in response to adequate stimuli applied to definite receptive fields, while the conditioned can be developed under the action of the most varied stimuli applied to different receptive fields. The performance of the unconditioned reflexes can be on the basis of the lower divisions of the central nervous system, brainstem and spinal cord, for example, knee reflex, while the conditioned are needed in higher parts of the brain cortex. The majority of the unconditioned reflexes are constant for all life, while the unconditioned reflexes are temporary and need connections between the centers. The conditioned reflexes can extinguish.
An experience on a dog was done will make us more understand about the conditioned reflexes. When a piece of meat is put within the mouth of a dog, it salivates. This is an example of unconditioned reflex that is present since birth and requires no training, practice, or experience. From experience, the dog knows what is the appearance or smell of meat. It is obvious that is also a form of learning. The typical procedure for classical conditioned reflex induction involves presentation of a neutral stimulus along with a stimulus of some significance. The neutral stimulus could be any event that does not result in an overt behavioral response from the organism under investigation. This is referred to as conditioned stimulus. If the conditioned stimuli and the unconditioned stimuli are repeatedly paired, eventually the two stimuli become associated and the organism begins to produce behavioral response to the conditioned stimuli. This is called the conditioned response. A bell can be ringed and a piece of meat may be supplied following the ringing of the bell. After only a few such sessions, it will be seen that the dog now begins to salivate as soon as it hears the sound of the bell, even if there is no following up by supplying the meat. Or in other words, the dog has learned to associate condition to the ringing of the bell with the meat as shown in this picture. This form of conditioning is called classical or Pavlovian conditioning. In this type of conditioning, the subject, which is the dog, has no control over the stimulus. Moreover, the conditioning stimulus, bell in the above example, is followed by the unconditioned stimulus, which is the meat.
For a conditioned reflex to appear, it's necessary that certain conditions are fulfilled. Coexistence in time, several times repeated, of the indifferent agent. The unconditioned stimulus, in the previous example, the sound of the bell, presentation of the meat. The indifferent agent should somewhat precede 1 to 5 seconds the unconditioned stimulus. Unconditioned stimulus should be stronger by its biological importance. Food is a stronger stimulus than bell or light. Conditioned stimulus should be indifferent. The orientation reaction to it should be extinguished. Absence of other stimuli that could induce externally cause inhibition. If we simultaneously whip the animal or splash it with cold water, we provoke inhibition, setting loose defensive reactions. The animal should be healthy and active. The centers responsible for the conditioned and unconditioned stimuli perception should have high excitability. Stimuli from the visceral organs, fullness of the urinary bladder, rectum, should be excluded. The experiments should take place at the same time every day. Several dozens of combinations, 10 to 20 of conditioned and unconditioned stimuli, should be done during the experiment. In order to preserve the conditioned reflex, it's necessary to reinforce it periodically. Once the reflex is formed, the mere sound of the bell substitutes the presentation of the meat. But if we repeatedly ring the bell without showing the meat, after a certain time, the animal stops reacting with salivation and digestive secretion. In this picture, the food is the unconditioned stimulus because its effect on the dog were not learned. Instead, they triggered an unconditioned response that happened naturally and completely out of the dog's control. The metronome is at first neutral stimulus. Through process means that the neutral stimulus becomes the conditioned stimulus and the response to that is the conditioned response.
In this picture, what occurs inside the brain? When a dog sees the food, the signals from the eyes and nose stimulate the brain, which activates the salivation glands to secrete saliva to aid the dog with the digestion. When a dog hears the sound, the ears send a signal to the brain which takes note that has no reason to activate anything. When the two different neurological processes are being activated simultaneously, new synaptic connections occur between the auditory stimulus and the behavioral response. Over time, these synapses are strengthened so that it only takes the sound to activate the pathway leading to salivation. So let's make this experience. It's a classroom exercise. Sit down and relax for 2 minutes, then allow your partner to check and record your pulse rates. Your partner will then tap a pencil on the desk 5 times. Right after, stand up and hop on one leg for 30 seconds, and then check your pulse again. Repeat the procedure 4 times, having the partner record all data. After relaxing for the 5th time, your partner will tap the pencil 5 times as usual. Now, instead of getting up for the exercise, only check your pulse. If the conditioning was successful, your pulse rate will rise even without engaging in the exercise.
Some characteristic features of the conditioned reflexes. 1. Reinforcement. Suppose in a Pavlovian conditioning experiment, a bell is rung, which is the conditioning stimulus, and then meat is supplied to the dog. As a result, the reflex is established, so that when the bell rings, the dog salivates, the response or the behavior. By reinforcement, the whole procedure is repeated over and over again. 2. Conditioned internal inhibition. In the conditioning stimulus, if it's happening now in an animal where the sequence ringing salivation has been established, made without the follow-through by the unconditioned reflex, for example, supply of the meat in the above example, and the whole procedure is repeated several times, no response, so no salivation will occur anymore. That is, ringing the bell will no more elicit salivation. This phenomenon is called internal inhibition. 3. External inhibition can be understood with the help of a typical example. Normally, dogs are annoyed by cats. Now, a dog which has been conditioned to the sequence, ringing of the bell salivation, suddenly sees a cat after the bell has been rung. There will be no salivation despite the ringing of the bell. This is called external inhibition. The conditioned inhibition, according to both unconditioned and conditioned reflexes, one could identify the same type of inhibition. Their classification is given below. Inhibition of conditioned reflexes, unconditioned external inhibition, 1 external, 2 transmarginal, and B, unconditioned internal inhibition, 1 extinction, 2 delayed, 3 conditioned inhibitor, and 4 different reflex. What is unconditioned external and transmarginal kinds of inhibition are caused by inborn properties of the nervous system. They have not been developed. External as a kind of unconditioned inhibition can be caused by the action of various external stimuli. For example, an unknown person comes during the experiment. It will cause the orientation reflex. What is this? The amount of saliva in the dog will decrease. In human, it's like distraction of attention. If the same situation will be repeated several times, the orientation reaction will extinct. But there are some factors which always cause inhibition of conditioned reflexes. They are pain, strong stimulation of the visceral organs, urinary bladder, signals for defecation, sexual excitement. As impulses from these receptors are addressed to the centers outside of the conditioned connection, this kind of inhibition is known as external. Transmarginal inhibition. If the strength of the conditioned stimulus is too excessive, instead of increasing the strength of response reaction, its inhibition takes place. It has defense importance and prevents the exhaustion of the central nervous system. Transmarginal inhibition may also be caused by weak but monotonous long-acting stimulus, so sound of rain causes sleep. This is an example.
Conditioned internal kinds of inhibition of conditioned reflexes. In contrast to the unconditioned inhibition, which is produced by the first application of the stimulus, conditioned inhibition has to be developed. It is also known as internal because the conditioned stimuli are addressed to the centers inside of the conditioned connection. Extension to the conditioned reflex can be formed if conditioned stimulus is not reinforced by unconditioned stimulus many times. In the man, extension is the same as forgetting. It is a good feature of CNS because we forget only useless information. In natural condition, usually extinct only useless conditioned reflexes which has lost their importance. Differentiation of conditioned stimuli. If a nutritional conditioned reflex to some stimulus is established to a tone of 1000 Hz, the dog performs the same response to 900 and 1100 Hz. The phenomenon is known as generalization of the conditioned reflex. But if the tone of 1000 Hz will be constantly reinforced by an unconditioned stimulus, and signals close to it will be without reinforcements, the dog begins to distinguish the tone of 1000 Hz from the others. The reactions to the others' frequencies will extinguish, and secretion of saliva will stop. Differentiation is discrimination between two signals similar in physical properties, one of which is reinforced by an unconditioned stimulus like nutritional, pain, and etc.
Conditioned inhibitor. This kind of internal inhibition can be developed if some signal is constantly reinforced by unconditioned stimulation, but the combination of this signal with some other is never reinforced. Later, the combination loses its positive signal significance and becomes conditioned inhibitor. For instance, turning on the lamp is constantly reinforced by food, but combination of turning on the lamp and the bell is never used with unconditioned stimulation. The dog begins to distinguish the separate signal, light of the lamp, and its combination with the other. Delayed conditioned reflexes are performed by the response delay as a result of delay of the unconditioned stimulus reinforcement. If an unconditioned stimulus, for example food, is used in short time, 1 to 5 seconds, after the beginning of the conditioned agent, the conditioned reflex reaction, which is the salivation, occurs immediately after the beginning of signal stimulation. But if the reinforcing stimulus is gradually delayed, maximum to 2 to 3 minutes in the dogs, after the beginning of the conditioned stimulation, the conditioned reflex reaction will delay too. For example, after a sound of the bell, salivation will be 2 minutes later. In the man, the similar processes are patience and self-control.
That is the end. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.